So welcome to our panel discussion. My name is Chris Maxwell. I'm delighted to serve as your moderator for the panel discussion today. Our topic is predicting success, what we know about people who achieve. And we're privileged today to have three panelists with us who have a diverse and distinguished professional backgrounds, including expertise in research, education, and clinical psychology. For those who may be expecting George Weiss is not here today. So allow me to introduce our panelists. Closest to me is Dr. Angela Duckworth, Assistant Professor of Psychology. In the middle is Dr. Betsy Schur Levy, a clinical psychologist, and to the far corner of the table, to your far left, Dr. Cecile Paris-Frey, an educator. Here are the introductions, and I will provide a brief introduction, and then I'm going to pose one initial question to get the panel started. And we'll talk for 35, 40 minutes, and then we will open this up for questions to the room. So first, Dr. Angela Lee Duckworth. Angela is an assistant professor of psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. She studies non-IQ competencies that predict success both academically and professionally. Angela received a bachelor's degree in neurobiology from Harvard in 1992, and as a Marshall Scholar, a master's in neuroscience from Oxford. She completed her Doctor of Philosophy in Psychology at Penn. She's also found time to found a non-profit summer school. She's been a McKinsey management consultant, and she's also found time to teach math in the public schools of San Francisco, Philadelphia, and New York City. So welcome to Angela. Betsy Levy in the middle. Betsy is a clinical psychologist who resides in New York City. Betsy received her BA in psychology from the University of Pennsylvania, graduating summa cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa. She completed her Master of Science and Master of Philosophy degrees at Columbia and earned her PhD in psychology at Columbia University. Betsy has a full-time private practice in New York City, and she's been a psychotherapist for over 20 years. Betsy's private practice includes work with children, adolescents, adults, and couples. She's a psychological consultant for NBC TV and has been a guest on a number of radio shows. And finally, Dr. Cecile Paris-Frey. Cecile has a long and distinguished history of work in the field of education. After graduating from Penn with a Bachelor of Arts degree in political science, Cecile spent a number of years teaching English at Overbrook High School in Philadelphia and earned her master's degree in counseling and a doctorate in history of education at Penn. In 1976, Cecile began teaching in Lower Merion Schools District's Gifted Support Program, where she stayed through 2001. For the last 15 years of her tenure, Cecile supervised the Gifted program in all 10 of the district schools. So here's a general topic for today. These days, we are used to being able to predict things from the weather to the sex of an unborn child, but is it possible to predict success? And if so, what are the implications for how we raise our children and conduct our own lives? So with that as the topic, here's the opening question for the panel. In your sphere of practice, what do you define as success? And what have you learned about its achievement? And we'll start with Angela.
Thanks, Chris. My mic is on. Hi, it's a pleasure to be here, and I've known Chris for a couple of years in a number of settings. So when he asked, when the invitation came, well, would you have anything to say about success? I said, do I have anything to say about success? Literally, that is my research topic. So the challenge for me today will be, one, to master the pointer, and secondly, to keep myself to, I think Chris wanted our comments to be relatively short, so as to preserve a good half hour at the end for Q&A. So I'm going to actually probably give an overview and maybe even skip a few of the slides. Let me go back to that title slide. I entitled the talk Strategia, which is actually the Greek root for the English word strategy, and it translates directly into military general. And if I had one point to get across to you today, it will be that some aspects of success, some components that determine achievement in life, are teachable, learnable strategies. And in the same way, for those of you for whom a military analogy works, the idea is you have 100 soldiers, all right? If I didn't change the quality of your soldiers at all, if I didn't give them more effective weapons or change their rations or change their physical fitness, you just have 100 soldiers to deal with. The point of strategy is that where you array those soldiers before you go into battle can make the difference between winning and losing. And in the same way, if you didn't change anything fundamentally about your children's neurobiology, their frontal cortex, or even their physical health, are there strategies that your child or you could learn that would actually make you much more effective without, again, changing kind of the raw ingredients? So I'll try to make that case to you. And I want to begin with a quote from Clark Hull, so a very prominent psychologist of the early 20th century. So this quote is about 8 decades old, and I think it's just as timely now as it is when he first said it. Clark Hull reviewed the literature in psychology at the time, which was much easier because it was smaller. And he came to the following insight, which again, I think holds today, which is that if you look at the capacities, the competencies that determine achievement in life, the qualities that people have that make them successful, broadly we can group them into 2 buckets. On the one hand, we have what he called capacity, or one might say talent. And on the other hand, we have what Clark Hull called industry, or what I would call sort of effort. And if you recast this in a diagram, you can say that essentially what achievement is the combination of talent and effort. When I get interviewed by journalists, they like to ask me whether success is about talent or effort. So I try very hard to explain that my position is that it's not either talent or effort, but both talent and effort. So many journalists want to say, oh, well, you know what? Research says that talent doesn't matter at all, that really anybody can learn anything. You could be Mozart if you applied yourself. And in fact, raise your hand if you've heard of or read the book Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell. To some extent, that's sort of Malcolm Gladwell's message in the book. I am this unbelievably good writer through circumstance and hard work. And I take issue with that. I think that that's not true. I think Malcolm Gladwell, in addition to having a lot of luck and a lot of persistence, also was tremendously gifted. And so it was the combination of having a natural aptitude and the ability to work very hard, which produced his current success. So I am, as a researcher, particularly interested in this bubble, in sort of what determines how much effort or practice people will put forth. Because, to summarize a vast literature, if we can change our natural talent, if we can change how smart we are, how good musically we are, or artistically, well, we don't know, but one thing we do know is it's not easy. Right? So if anybody had a secret for making you 15 IQ points higher, you probably would have heard about it by now. And the reason is it's not easy to change talent, if you can change it at all, which again, it may be, but it's certainly not an easy thing. It may not be easy to change effort or practice either, but my intuition is that it's easier. So I focus on that. I want to give you a graph that kind of puts this in context. There's something called the 10,000-hour rule. And if you don't want to buy Malcolm Gladwell's book, you can just read the slide, essentially. It's more or less the same thing. And the idea is that if you study the development of skill or expertise, I mean, Chris opened up the panel saying, how do you define success? And I'll say that my research is very narrowly focused on achievement that can be objectively, quantifiably measured. So I'm not looking at, for example, someone's personal sense of whether they're accomplished. I'm looking at, where they rank in the spelling bee, what rank do you hold in the military, what's your class rank when you graduate from Penn, how much money do you make if you're a sales agent, etc. So I'm not making a statement that that's the only thing that's important, but it's the only thing that I study. So to summarize the research on the development of skill or expertise, what has been found is that across domains as diverse as piano, radiology, chess, violin, mathematics, that essentially there is a skill curve. And you can map the acquisition of skill as a function of the number of years or the number of hours of practice that an individual puts forth. And the one rule which is, it seems that has not yet been violated is that roughly 10,000 hours of what's called deliberate practice is necessary to reach world-class levels of expertise, no matter what domain you're in. So, whether it be, the skill of, piano playing or, reading radiology exams, etc. Now, the question about this graph to me has always been, why are we not all on these curves all the time? To give you an example, I've been running pretty much every day of my adult life. I am no faster than I ever was. I can time to a second what time I get in the front door because it's the same time I came in the lab, because I haven't been doing deliberate practice. So the point of this graph is, yes, it takes years and years of practice, but the subtle point is that the practice is the hardest kind. It's doing what you can't yet do. It's working on those things that runners do, like hill training and VO2 max, and you gotta run till you throw up, and then you know that you've got something. So I don't do any of that, at least for running, and that's why I'm no better at running. So it takes years and years of deliberate practice, not just any old kind of practice. And if you're a less talented individual, I would say your graph looks more like this. So it's not to say that everybody can reach world-class performance if you just put in your 10,000 hours. It's not just effort. But the point is, how far up your particular curve can you get? And that's what I study. What are the motivation or personality traits that enable people to ascend this high curve for the thing that they do care about? I study these two things, grit and self-control, because in addition to some other things, like self-efficacy, your confidence that you can do something, and maybe how interested you are in the endeavor itself, in addition to many other factors, I believe that grit, which I'll define for you, and self-control are incredibly important in determining how much practice people can actually invest. So I want to start with grit. Grit I define as a quality of two things. So it's a combination of having sustained passion for a consistent goal and the perseverance to keep going towards that goal in the face of adversity. So passion and perseverance, these two complementary pieces that together make you a gritty individual. And I usually measure this quality using questionnaires. You can actually go to my website and download it and score it and see how gritty you are, and you can look at yourself relative to West Point cadets and spelling bee kids and Americans of different ages, etc. But the key here is that this is a quality of stamina. Woody Allen is oft-cited as saying, success in life is 80% showing up. And I think he was mostly right. But I think the key is that you have to show up again and again, right? It's not like showing up once, because that's hard, but showing up, every day to get in your 10,000 hours. And when I talk to undergraduates who are graduating from Penn, and I know some of our panelists have, kids who are one of our panelists has a kid who's graduated. The interesting thing to me is to see these incredibly bright young people who are certainly capable of hard work. But I think this first piece of grit, the ability to sustain an interest and a commitment for a very long time is not obvious to a lot of Penn graduates. They know that you have to work hard, but do you know you have to work hard at a given thing for years and years and years, as opposed to changing your career every few years, such that you're always on a new learning curve, but you're never mastering any one curve. So I think that this idea of stamina in the domain of interest is almost as important, or maybe it's not as obvious to young people as the second one. I'm probably over my time, so I'll just try to whiz through the last slides, and in Q&A you can tell me, let's go back to a certain topic. What we found by studying spelling bee kids, these are the kids who go to Washington in May and stand up in front of the ESPN cameras and spell words like Oostfracht. We interviewed them before the spelling bee, and we've done this study twice in a row. The first thing we find is that grit measured prior to the spelling bee predicts who's going to win the spelling bee. So grittier kids actually get farther. And the reason why grittier kids get farther is they spend more hours doing deliberate practice. And the way to read this graph is to say, we grouped the activities which were deliberate practice, hard, effortful, focused practice on exactly the things that they couldn't yet do. Then we also asked them about testing, basically being quizzed by their parents and their friends, which, believe it or not, was relatively more enjoyable than deliberate practice. So you might not think that being quizzed is fun, but it's more fun than learning word roots and so forth. And these kids are highly verbal. All of them would actually rather be doing non-spelling bee activities. They would rather be actually reading or playing Scrabble than studying for the spelling bee or testing. being tested. And the insight from this study was that if you look at the dark bars, that's how enjoyable those activities were rated by the kids. Doing other things like reading books is way more fun than studying for the spelling bee, particularly this kind of effortful, deliberate practice. Look at the gray bars. Deliberate practice is, in turn, the most effortful of the three activities, right? But what we find is that essentially, let me just tell you the bottom line, and if you're quantitatively oriented, you can look at the graphs. It's how much you read and how much time you spend playing Scrabble does not predict how well you do. Being quizzed by your parents or your friends, well, that's a little more fun, but that does not predict how well you do. It's deliberate practice. So the point here is that, yes, thousands and thousands of hours of deliberate practice, but that deliberate practice is not necessarily fun, and it's not exactly effortless either. So if it's not exactly fun, and it takes a whole lot of effort, the question is, what enables you to do those hours and hours of practice? And then again, my argument is that at least part of that answer is grit and self-control. If you have the grit to have a goal that stands off in the future, and you can stay committed to that goal over years, despite the inevitable failures, setbacks, and temptations to do something new, then you've won half the battle. But I would argue that the other half of the battle is essentially good old-fashioned self-discipline. So if grit is being able to sustain a goal over years and years and not give up, sort of to show up, as Woody Allen would say, again and again, self-control helps you actually do something productive once you've shown up, right? So it turns out, for example, that your children, if you beat them while they were studying or doing homework, would say, actually, just like practicing for the spelling bee, it's not easy and it's not that fun. But if you ask them, they will recognize that it's actually the thing that they ought to be doing. So self-control helps you essentially make decisions and choose behaviors that are productive for you in the long run, even though in the moment they don't feel good. And I guess what I'll do in the Q&A, if I have time, is to talk about strategies that have been shown in research that essentially facilitate self-control and grit. Particularly self-control because it's been studied more. But there are strategies, without, again, changing the kids' genes or their brains, where you teach them, like, oh, if you do it this way, it makes a task which requires a lot of self-control tremendously easier, as opposed to certain strategies that kids come up with on their own that actually end up being self-sabotaging. So you ask them what they're doing, they're like, oh, I'm doing this thing, I'm looking at it this way to make this task easier. And in fact, they're doing the opposite. They're making the task harder. So I'll leave those slides for the Q&A so that I don't hog up the rest of the time.
Thank you very much, Angela. And we'll jump to Seal now. Again, Seal, in your sphere of practice, what do you define as success and what have you learned about its achievement?
I'm coming at this from exactly the opposite point. From who the children are, and these children who do spelling bees and stuff like that, okay? As Chris said, I spent the last 20 years of my public school teaching career working with gifted kids, with parents, with teachers, and with counselors. I want to start out with a quote from Bruno Bettelheim. Bruno Bettelheim once said, "Successful child rearing means the raising of a child who may not necessarily become a success in the eyes of the world, but who is satisfied with himself." Many gifted kids never, ever reach that goal, okay? When raising gifted kids, bright kids, the adage is even more important. Even though gifted kids are thought to be successful high achievers, there are several caveats that must be made before one can draw these conclusions. Gifted kids are not all white, bright, and polite, which one wag said a long time ago. They have issues, they come from diverse backgrounds, some of them have learning disabilities, many of them are underachievers. Neither are all high achievers. Neither are they all high achievers, or high achievers in the eyes of the world, and that's the difference, right? Okay. Further, although they may appear successful to the outside world, many are very insecure about their abilities and their gifts. They feel like frauds very often. In adults, happiness is seen as positive affect, and success is defined as accomplishing those things valued by one's culture, flourishing in terms of goals set forth by one's own society, which are socialized into the community in which one is raised. An additional question arises, does happiness lead to success, or does success lead to happiness? Again, this concept is probably more related to adults than to children, including identified gifted children. First of all, the whole issue of identifying gifted children is very weird. Often, the only thing that school districts use is an IQ of 130. And I will say that in terms of money spent on gifted kids, 2 cents of every education dollar goes toward the gifted. Not good. And only 33 states require gifted education, which means the rest of the states have no gifted education, and often gifted kids are just left to flounder. Gifted kids have many locus of control issues. In order to be considered high achievers, gifted kids must make high grades. This heads to an external locus of control, and students meet the expectations of teachers and parents rather than following their bliss in learning. The kids tend to become extrinsically motivated, learning to play the school game rather than developing deep academic and creative interests. And this is sad, but this is the way it works. Okay, I'm thinking about the spelling bee kids. Many of them get a great deal of pressure.
That is true. No, I agree. I mean, when we interviewed the kids, some of the kids are sort of intrinsic. It seems, at least, right, that they are, but many of them are getting some pressure.
Right. After that, the movie Spellbound, which I wanted to leave after the first 5 minutes of it. Okay. Schools often make work appropriate for heterogeneous classes rather than differentiating for gifted students until middle or high school. Hence, students never learn the importance of working hard and finding diverse paths to achieve success. When they finally hit a class that needs real perseverance, they have no clue how to handle this new caveat. And again, if they do follow their interests, teachers and parents tend to label them as underachievers. Carol Dweck, a researcher at Stanford, has studied the "you're so smart" syndrome versus telling kids they can achieve if they work hard. She finds the latter to be much more productive in a learning process. If kids keep hearing, "you're so smart" or "you're so good at math," that conveys the idea that intelligence is a fixed innate quality, and therefore they don't have much control over the academic success and failures. Kids need to be challenged from an early age. At many schools can't, won't, or don't do this. And I don't know if you remember your own education, but I remember just sitting with a book and a book for a long time. I'd bring in a novel, and the teacher would be babbling on, and everybody would be on page 3, and I'd be reading my novel. So, parents, especially in affluent communities, wear their child's gifted label as a sign of their own achievement. True. Been there. They begin grooming their kids for an Ivy League education from first grade. Some kids are now beginning to practice for the SATs with tutors by 6th grade. Again, the pressure on students can be extreme. In addition, many parents practice overprotective parenting, either by being over-controlling or overindulgent. Oh, you don't have to do your homework, you look so tired, tell the teacher the dog ate your homework, that kind of thing. Okay, in urban settings, the pressure can be just the opposite. Minority kids who do well are accused of being Oreos or acting white by their peers, and sometimes by their parents. I don't know, anyone who has ever seen the movie Finding Forrester will remember an inner-city black kid who gets a scholarship to a private school in Manhattan, ostensibly because he's a great basketball player. Yet he's also a gifted writer, and the crisis in the movie comes when he's accused of cheating on an essay he's turned in. It's on video, and it's really worth seeing. In schools, for many teachers and parents, achievement is measured by grades. Grades are often determined by conformity to teacher demands rather than by innovation and creativity. What do you mean? You didn't answer the question. I asked A, B, C, and you answered B, C, D. And kids get points deducted for that kind of thing. Adolescence is a time of identity formation. This is often difficult for gifted kids who have trouble establishing a cohesive sense of self needed for achievement. because they are drawn to many different directions. One last issue, and that's the problem of convergent versus divergent thinkers. And this often determines achievement. Convergent thinkers are those who can follow a straight line of reasoning from A to B to C. School projects, exams, and standardized tests all work well for convergent thinkers. But many gifted kids are divergent thinkers who think outside the box. They tend to drive their teachers and parents nuts because the parents know they're really bright, but they don't do what the parents want, what the school wants, etc., etc. Think of Steve Jobs and Wozniak, the creators of the Apple computer, dropping out of college to build their creation in a garage. Or of Bill Gates, another college dropout who, as we all know, founded Microsoft and is doing quite well. In the Inquirer today, there's an article about someone named Scott Fraser, who was my student, who was a bird watcher. Scott Fraser's parents almost killed him by the time he got out of high school. Was exceedingly bright, did his own thing, wouldn't go to college, spent 3 years following the Grateful Dead after he graduated. He was my student, so I know. Yes, Then he came back and he said, well, maybe I'll go to college. And, the long and short of it is he founded his own computer company, has 50 people working for him now. I used to share Man Music Center tickets with him, so we've kept in touch. Is married, and he's a bird watcher, and on the side. And he's doing very well. But if you have a kid like that and you're a parent, it takes a long time to come to terms with that. And I'm not sure his parents ever have. It was just funny to see it in the paper today. Okay, so for gifted students, achievement, success, and happiness are very different from adults, especially when measured by the same definitions. Are gifted children happy? Do they ever achieve? Of course, but much of their success comes from an almost serendipitous commingling of home, school, and self. Good parents encourage their kids to follow their bliss, allow them to make mistakes, and force them to suffer the consequences of their actions. In other words, they're not these overprotective parents who make up excuses for them all the time. I know of one parent who used to tell his son, you're so smart, you don't have to do your homework. And he told him this from the time he was a little boy, okay? The message to the kid wasn't possibly negative. By high school, when he began to have trouble with math, he had no coping mechanism whatsoever, and he ended up not going to college. Parents also have to look for signs of unhappiness, either because of external or internal pressures. Telling a kid it's Harvard or nothing can cause severe stress and depression, and many, a surprising number of parents begin grooming their kids in first grade for Harvard, or at the very least, Penn. They start in kindergarten for Penn, Betsy said. Well, Penn is doing much better now than when I went here 50 years ago. Okay. Schools are also at fault. This is a sort of general blaming of everybody. Schools, too, have to present appropriate materials, forcing gifted kids to work hard long before high school. Every kid, even the brightest, has limits, and they should be made to stretch these limits from an early age. Unfortunately, many school districts are unwilling to do this or don't even understand how to do this. And I will say positive about Lower Merion, since it's made so many negative, things in the newspaper lately, is that they really work with their gifted kids. And if they find a kid in math, for example, who's more than 2 years above where the rest of the class is, they will hire a tutor, they will move him up to the next level or her up to the next level. And many of the kids in Lower Merion end up going to Penn or Villanova or Haverford and doing their math there when they finish, what they have up to that point.
Or at the very least, Harvard.
Too far. They have to be able to get on the train and then come home. Anyway, I taught a girl who finished all the undergraduate work for artificial intelligence at Penn at the same time that she was going to Lower Merion and taking the rest of her classes. She even managed to pick up a couple of graduate credits in artificial intelligence. Okay. The happiest students I had were those who were able, because of good parents and a flexible school system, to follow their bliss. And follow their bliss it's very difficult. I just want to say one thing about IQ while I'm talking, and that is, think of if 130 is gifted, average is between 100 and 130. But there are kids who have IQs close to 160, which means they're as different from the 130 kids as the kids with 100 are. And so it's very difficult and wrong to just lump all gifted kids into one big pile. And the 150, 160 IQ kids are the ones that our school district helped to nurture. And as my former boss used to call the 130, 135 kids, garden variety gifted, which in a school district like Lower Merion really is sort of garden variety. Okay. A Duke University study made of adults who were labeled as gifted concluded, no matter what their background, they confessed to having been misunderstood for years, to being bored, held back, and having been plagued by self-doubt and struggling with loneliness. Yet once they had a legitimate explanation of their difference, they quickly began a life review process. Armed with new information, they set off on a journey of rediscovery to unearth self-truths that had been lost. They soon realized that their distorted self-concepts were largely the result of unintended commentary about their difference. One more comment. Popularity, especially for girls, is as important as it was a long time ago, and girls somehow by middle school get the message you shouldn't be too smart and you shouldn't be too forward if you want to have friends. And so this is the kind of thing that really impacts on gifted kids, and they have to learn, to make their own decisions. Okay. Happiness, success, and achievement, as I said, are very different for all students, but especially identified gifted students are under enormous pressure to achieve by playing the game and often give up their own autonomy to do so.
Thank you, Sarah. And now Betsy.
Well, up until about just 10 minutes ago, I was hoping I had at least 1 out of 3 gifted children. And as of this moment, I'm hoping I have 0 out of 3 gifted children. But it leads beautifully into my topic, actually. After hearing the research on gifted children and success and achievement and self-control, etc., I come from yet a third place, and that is really the ear of listening to the psychotherapy patient day after day after day, week after week, year after year, and hear them define for themselves, intrinsically embedded in the treatment, in the language of the psychotherapy, the meaning of success and the meaning of personal achievement, the meaning of self-confidence, and of course the question we want to discuss in greater depth later today, does happiness lead to success? Does success lead to happiness? Is that a question that one can even answer in a reasonable way, or are they interrelated concepts? So I did my own little study in the last few weeks, because it's worked here when I've spoken at Penn before, and spoke with some of my patients rather directly about their experience of success. And what is really extraordinary is how different it is for each individual. That is in terms of their developmental experiences as a child, as Cecile said, in terms of their parenting, in terms of their sense of self-control, the capacity for self-control, the capacity for grit, and the way that this varies and changes from patient to patient. I want to tell you just a few very quick vignettes from the clinical setting that will bring home to you the way that achievement and attachment, and by that I mean interpersonal relationships and secure interpersonal relationships, and happiness and success all blend together, but are really modified by each individual's true interpsychic experience and interpersonal experience. I'm going to start with a 9.5-year-old young girl, Amanda, who tragically at the age of 7 lost her mom very suddenly in the middle of her school day. And to use the word resilience really underestimates the remarkable qualities of this young woman 2 years later, who will certainly be both in your gifted program and standing out on your charts, especially when this treatment gets rolling. And I asked her what the definition of success was, and while the first thing she said, just instinctually, was, "It's like I found my mother's favorite pillow that I've been looking for at Grandma's, and that would be a success, a victory, and I would be happy." And while she started with the issue of attachment, certainly, she went straight on to her academic life. Success is feeling happy for yourself. It is the feeling that you reached or achieved your goal. Both, actually, because usually when you, and I asked her about success and happiness, and she said both go together, because usually when you are happy, you are more successful. And when you succeed, it usually makes you happy. I think they go together. And this is a 9-year-old. And I think it highlights, the intrapsychic world as well as the interpersonal world and the academic world. When you then went on to interview her father, who suffered that same tragic sudden loss of his spouse at age 40, his defenses were so much more in place that he couldn't come right out and talk about the pillow with the wonderful smell and memory of the mother, but immediately, as a businessman, went into success is reaching a certain goal and an achievement of a particular endeavor. And it was a dramatic difference between a father and a daughter who are so beautifully interpersonally related. In fact, she calls him both her mother and his father, and they just celebrated Mother's Day, the two of them, with him as the mother. It's really quite magnificent. And contrast this with a young dental student from one of the Penns or Harvards of the world that we start studying for in kindergarten, who said specifically, success is completing tasks, strategies for having an independent day. Now this is a young student, dental student, who cannot formulate one independent day. It's really striking because she's absolutely brilliant. It's being self-directed and ready for social demands. Each level achievement is one kind of success, like getting an A on a test or a job well done from your boss. These contribute to success, but in a successful place, your mind has to be in that place where you appreciate your achievements. That's my problem, isn't it, Betsy? My mind isn't in that place where I appreciate my achievements. So this was such a significant remark in that achievement, yes, you can get there with grit and self-control, but can you experience it, build upon it, and use it to broaden your interpersonal skills, your professional skills, and of course your sense of self-esteem and self-worth. She went on to speak about, for her, the real meaning of success has to do with balance. And I loved this term. I wrote my first psych paper at Penn 100 years ago with Paul Rosen. He's still here and I'm still here. We're both not 100 though, I hope, on balance. And she spoke to putting together the intrapsychic and the social and the psychosocial spheres. I thought that this vignette was particularly interesting. Here we have another physician. Success is helping the most people you can in the time you are given on earth. In my life, success and happiness are not interrelated constructs. She was the first to say this. They only relate to each other if you define success as happiness or happiness as success, but I don't. I feel successful when a patient feels heard, even if I am unsuccessful in solving their medical problem. And I am unhappy if they do not feel heard. Personal happiness for me is not focused on achievement. Attachment is the main factor. And then, of course, she went on to say, after all, look at my marriage, my family, and it really was beginning to strike me how complex a theoretical construct success, achievement, and happiness are. And now I'll conclude before going on to some of the other topics with two couples that made the exact same point and brings to our attention not only age differences and developmental differences and intrapsychic differences, but gender differences, which I hope is something we can get to today. One couple newly married, one couple engaged. In both, the woman is the business executive and the man more artistic. Very interesting. This woman, the businesswoman said, for me, being successful is content and happy, a feeling inside. Getting married now doesn't make me feel successful per se, just more complete and whole. But it does not translate into success. It translates into happiness. Success is my life in my professional world. If you had asked me this 10 years ago, and I asked what would have been the difference, she said that then, 10 or 15 years ago, success would have been related to business, career, and achievement, and now success would be related to what we spoke about earlier, the balance, career satisfaction, family, and relationships. So this certainly speaks about the developmental course of success and achievement. In both cases, and I'm certainly making no gender comment here that I hope will be construed the right way, but the wrong way, but whoops, that was a great Freudian slip. But in both cases, I'm really good at Freudian slips. But in both cases, the husband or fiance, in this case, answer was, success is happiness and health. And then this gentleman went, period. And the other fiance said, success is being happy. And I thought, this is not what the room will predict. And I'm going to be sitting with Angela Duckworth, and she's not going to say this is what the research predicts about gender differences, or are you?
About like how men and women view success
Yes,
and happiness.
exactly. But the men were just very simple, success and happiness. Now, whether that's complexly related to their professional lives or not, we can talk about. It may be age and development, etc. And these clinical vignettes lead well into, the early works of Freud. When I was speaking with Chris Maxwell about this work, he told me of a colleague of his and Angela's that they worked with named Chris Peterson at the University of Michigan. And I believe you can help me out here, Chris, but when asked to define the most important two positive findings about positive psychology, this wonderful field you're exploring here, certainly first and foremost at the University of Pennsylvania, not Harvard, his answer to these two words was other people. And that certainly went along with what I wanted to share with you today. And we should remember the early works of Sigmund Freud, where he talked about what we learned here at Penn in my day as NFOS, the neurotic fear of success, where he talked about successful people worrying, having tremendous anxiety about being the envy of others, being begrudged by others, not liked because of their successes, and actually sabotaging themselves. Of course, Freud, in his way, described this as an Oedipal anxiety. Whether we would relate that to the current research we're doing now, I don't know. But it's saying that it was too much of an Oedipal victory to win, and therefore people were more comfortable with mediocrity, moderation, if not even losing. So it goes into some very interesting psychodynamic concepts, which we'll explore in greater depth later. Thank you.
Thank you, panelists. A quick question then for the panel, and you can tackle this any way you like. all of you have a great experience with working with young people, children, in schools, in universities, and even in nurseries. So here's a question. How can we best prepare youth to anticipate and manage adversity, in short, to build resilience so they can be successful in the real world? What sort of strategies do you think are effective?
So the one, I like to speak from primarily my own research. So the one thing among others, I'm sure, that seems to predict grit or resilience is optimism. Specifically, when something bad happens, which as we know is inevitable and potentially a daily thing, small or big bad things, we often don't know why. Sometimes we really know why, and that's not as important as those many cases when you are not really sure what exactly happened to make you not get the fellowship, not graduate summa cum laude, get passed over by a potential girlfriend or boyfriend, etc. So optimism, and this is actually work that was done here at Penn in the 70s. It was actually, it led to some of the first treatments for depression, as you probably both know. But having an optimistic style of explaining bad things is a predictor of resilience and grit, specifically. And what does it mean to have an optimistic style? It means that when you don't know why something bad happened, your immediate instinct is to think of causes that are specific and changeable. So the opposite of being an optimist is being a pessimist, and we may recognize this tendency in ourselves as basically catastrophizing. So you don't do well on my midterm, and your first impulse, you're not really sure why, but your first impulse to say, ugh, I'm an idiot. Right? It's not specific, it's global, it's sort of like everything about you, right? And then also it's not easily fixable, right? As opposed to an optimistic explanation, which would mean the first thing that leaps to mind is, oh, I didn't study enough the reading this time, which is, something very specific and which you can remediate the next time you take my quiz. So optimism, thankfully, falls under the category of strategia. In other words, it's very teachable and learnable. Parents have a lot to do with it, and also there are programs that have been developed here at Penn and now are being taught to kids, and also adults.
Again, this is a parental approach, and it has to be from the beginning. A kid does something wrong. How the parent reacts may eventually make the kid an optimist or a pessimist. And if a parent says, let's talk about what happened. Why did you do it? How can you change it the next time? That at least brings out the specificity. If a parent says, that's ridiculous, go to your room, with no discussion whatsoever, the kid is going to say, what did I do? How did it happen? And little kids and even big kids need to talk out these things. They really can't just internalize it. They're not mature enough, and they really don't have the skills. And parents can teach that discussion kind of thing so that kids can eventually learn it themselves.
And to follow up on that idea of the parental role, certainly in trying to increase a sense of resilience in the child, we want a very what's called resilient ego. And a lot of the research shows that the parent is a model. You want to see your parents be resilient as well. Parents make mistakes at work. Parents make mistakes at home with their children. And they can say, I've made a mistake. Here's my strategies for modifying the mistake. Here's how I'm going to work not to do it again next time. But it's not seeing your parent be so hard on themselves and criticize themselves or shy away from the next challenge or task, so that you feel that in the face of your humanness, your error, your mistakes, you can still keep going. And we're looking for that kind of self-confidence and resilience to really enhance that sense of optimism going forward.
Thank you. I was reading something by Seal that Seal had written, and it prompted this question. What strategies are particularly helpful in working not only with the gifted, but also those who are underachievers?
That's not an oxymoron. There are many gifted underachievers, kids who don't play the game. And some of them are very bright. And the strategies are, again, talking through, maybe with the teacher, maybe with the counselor, exploring why the kid won't do it. I remember a student that I had a long time ago when computers were first coming out, and his mother would come to meetings and she'd say, "Oh, he can't read. I can't get him to read anything." Meantime, he was reading computer manuals. And, later he ended up with a PhD in computer science. But parents have to move off the dime and not expect that the kid is going to do it because the parent says to do it, or the school says to do it, or the teacher says, write in every other line, and the kid writes on every line, and it happens. So I think the kid also has to understand the consequences, and that's another thing that should be discussed. If you end up with all Fs, you're not going to get into college. And again, that happens, it should happen early and be discussed as an ongoing, thing. And definitely, kids have to develop strategies. I don't know, Angela, do you know a particular book that parents could use?
On strategies to
Yeah.
help kids. I mean, one of the, I actually, as Chris mentioned, used to be a teacher, and I think that kind of got me into understanding or being interested in achievement. Because as a classroom teacher teaching math to kids going through puberty, that was fun, and kids who were, thank God, past puberty, that it was so clear to me that there was more than quote-unquote a talent that was at work, although again, I saw obviously talent did play a role. So, the one of the studies that I've done has been to look at what predicts grade point average. Now, again, very narrow. So that's a measure of achievement, which is not the same as how happy the kid is, and there's a bit of a kind of the system here. There's sort of grades are grades given by the system. But if you exclude those very important questions for a moment, and you are interested in like who gets better grades at Penn, who gets better grades in high school, etc., it turns out that that self-control, self-discipline, being able to do something which is not very fun right now, but actually has long-term payoffs, is incredibly predictive of grades, and a better predictor, at least in my studies, than your IQ. And I think that's partly because it is something of a game. It is sort of like, a history project is due, and, whether you feel like doing it right now or not, I'm going to grade what you turn in. And the quiz is on Thursday, and the final exam's next Friday. So, having the ability to regulate your attention, to regulate your behavior, to forego temptation, which means not texting your friends, not going to Facebook, not going out, and instead doing something that has a long-term payoff, that's very important. So yeah, there are many strategies, I think, that help with self-control that we're just beginning to understand. I'll just say one of them, and if people are interested, they can ask other questions. One is out of sight is out of mind. So kids have different temptations. Now, these temptations are different for different kids. I personally was able to do all of my homework in front of the television, but for other kids, I would say I'm not recommending that. But for most kids, television is a very potent distractor, right? So whatever the idiosyncratic temptation is for that particular child, the one great strategy is out of sight, out of mind. So if they can't sort of resist the Wii when it's sitting there in the middle of the living room, then put it in a cabinet, that's just inconvenient and out of sight, so that when they sort of look around the room, it's not the first thing that they see. And there are many colloquial expressions like devil get thee behind me, or out of sight, out of mind, which have this intuition that if it's not in front of you, you actually may forget about it. And I have a 5-year-old who, when we came back from Halloween and you get this ginormous bag of, candy, and if you're 5, that's really all you want to do is eat the candy. She said to me, "Mommy, put it in the freezer, because if I don't see it, then I won't think about it." She's going to be a psychologist someday. Well, it's not perfect, but it helps.
Just one more thing about parenting. Parents can say no. You don't kill a kid's self-esteem if you say no television. And if they argue, say, when you can support yourself, you can do whatever you want. My children heard that so many times, but it's true. You're the parent. You're the one making the decisions with them, and you can make a compromise. But as you said with the Wii, if you don't want them to use it, they shouldn't use it,
Yeah, I agree. Oh, can I just say one thing? I have undergraduates who always have their laptops open, and once in my class, I had a guest lecturer, and I had to go to the bathroom. So I went up the aisle, and when I came back down the aisle, Facebook, Gmail, and I said to, I didn't mandate it, but I admonished my students, as I would admonish my own children, that, that is like having a big fat temptation right in front of you. And if I had that temptation, I'd probably go on Facebook too, because it's a little bit more fun than teaching you the next concept in the research conference.
Right.
So I think these basic common sense things like, well, why would you put the temptation right in front of you? If you're sitting here in a panel, you might think, oh, of course, we wouldn't do that. But in daily life, so many of us do.
So easy.
Right, and the distractors that these kids are faced with every day is really becoming a very critical factor in diminishing their sense of performance and the capacity to focus. I think at times we must let them fail and see that being on Facebook and Gmail chat and IM and texting the night before your physics AP exam, you might not do well.
Yeah.
And you'll have to change something. I just want to bring the audience's attention to what's out there in the bookstores right now to address just this question about strategies. If you don't have access to this kind of empirical research, and you're not in this world, there really is a wealth of research right now and literature that you can come and sort of peruse after the lecture. And in fact, Stephen Covey's piece, which has been out for years and years and years, is on just that, the 7 habits of highly effective people. There's a lot of strategic work being done on how to enhance whatever strategies we can depend on for greater performance, greater self-esteem, greater achievement.
So we have now approached the time that you've all been waiting for, your opportunity to ask this brilliant panel your questions. If you speak loudly, we should all be able to hear you. And I will call on the lady on the far right there. Appropriate engagement is a question. Panel, do you want to give this a shot?
I think I can begin. You're talking about the many different psychological variables and academic or social or spiritual or religious, you name it, variables that affect us and our ability to connect to, attach to, be committed to a task that might be therefore achievement oriented. Again, here you're speaking to individual needs, individual psychological preferences and needs, which is why, when I was playing around with how to define happiness and success and using the letters to define themselves, self-knowledge kept coming up and self-satisfaction. One should, quote, in quotes, of course, engage in activities that are truly of interest, and they probably will have a greater sense of success and achievement. That's not to say it shouldn't be challenging. I'm not suggesting just easy areas of engagement, but I'm talking about areas of engagement that have meaning.
So happiness and success strategies for adults as well as the children.
Well, as the other panelists have been appropriately pointed out, success and happiness may not be synonymous, at least for many people. So strategies that predict happiness, well, I'm happy to say there's a whole industry around that, and essentially that is the discipline of positive psychology. And as was appropriately mentioned, other people. So if the number one predictor of being happy at any stage of life, but particularly as you get older, is the number and the quality of intimate relations. And by the way, we know from work on baboons, turns out also here at Penn, at least the professors are, that it's not having lots and lots of, well, no, not the baby, yeah, well, no, they study baboons. So we know from primate work as well as with human work that it's not the number of friendships that are sort of those B-level friends, your friendly with them. It's a number of real friends. It's the number of like high quality, you call them back, they call you back, you actually know something about what's going on in their lives, that kind of friendship. So there have been lots of studies cleverly done showing that at every stage of life, but particularly as you get older, as many people become more isolated. So 15-year-olds have lots of problems, but being around other people intimately is not one of them, typically. Again, typically. So other people. So if you want to ask the question of like what predicts happiness as you get older in life, it's all about those relations. If you want to ask, what predicts success as you maybe even transition out of the workplace, one strategy I did want to mention is, and the reason why I think it's appropriate for this question is it doesn't matter what your goal is. It doesn't have to be a goal that's professional in terms of your paid work. Whatever your goal is, it seems like there are two things that people sort of do but could do better that will help them achieve that goal. Now, hopefully, it's a goal which is really intrinsic, right, and not you're doing it for somebody else. So whatever your goal is, it's goal setting and goal planning. So here are two tips. The first one is that most people, when you say, let's set a goal for next year for, like your performance in Sudoku or your physical fitness program or, whatever it is, most people actually start off with kind of do your best kind of goals. So the thing that comes to mind is like, I just want to get better at my exercise program. Very vague. So if you want to set a goal, it has to be specific and, at the right level of challenge. So, something feasible but a little bit beyond where you are. But the key is specificity. And the reason why vague goals don't work is that you never really know whether you got to the goal or, in fact, didn't get to. So there's never any feedback on a vague goal. But you always get feedback on a specific measurable goal. So first of all, if you have whatever you're doing at whatever stage of life, goal setting, specific goal setting seems to be the right way to go. And the second thing is planning. Once you have a specific goal, like I want to go to the gym 3 days a week, starting now, you have to have a plan. And this is where many bright people, they never get to the plan part. So they have to actually specify. We do studies with kids where we make them. Speaking of making them, we make them, make a plan, and we say, where, when, and how are you going to achieve your goal? And by the way, when we do this work, we don't give them goals, we let them come up with their own intrinsically important goals. And just specifying where, when, and how they're going to do something can vastly improve their performance. So for example, we recruited a sample of kids who were juniors in high school and who all said they wanted to do better on the PSAT. And so we gave them all free books to study for the PSAT. These were all kids who sort of volunteered and said they wanted to study on their own. And the kids who just took 15 minutes to write down where, when, and how they were going to study did 70% more questions than the kids who just said, I really do want to study. So it's a very effective thing. And how many of us sort of I really need to get to the gym, but we never get down to saying, when am I going to get to the gym? Where am I, when is this actually happening? So goal setting and planning are two strategies that help there.
I would just say it's like making a New Year's resolution. And many people make many, many New Year's resolutions, and by the second week, they're not doing any of them. So you really have to limit, think what's important, how you're going to reach it. I'm a retired person, so I can say that.
And just to conclude, my experience has been clinically and personally that one needs to feel inspired by their aging and their wisdom. And if you have the motivation to continue to work, to continue to be involved in things that are meaningful to you, your mind will absolutely stay more productive. And your body will probably, let's hope, stay more healthy. Retirement doesn't mean withdrawal. Retirement means time to pursue other interests. You might not be the same paid employee of a 40-hour work week. You might actually be doing more. And I have actually found in the last 10 years that I am doing more with greater self-confidence, and that age has been a positive factor. And I think that we're seeing people live much longer. This is a different culture now. And we need to embrace aging and embrace the mind and embrace the longer people are vibrant than we did maybe 20 years ago. So it was a terrific question, I think, you posed.
Thank you. More questions? All the way in the back in the red shirt.
I will say that many bright kids suffer from perfectionism. And rather than do something and make a mistake, they just won't do it. Or they'll obsess on it and do it over and over and over. And that's, 3 days on a 2-page essay. And there has to be a way, maybe, working with somebody, a therapist or something, to get her to relax. And if it's not a perfect paper the first time, that's okay. Because when she goes off to college and she puts all these internal pressures on herself, it really doesn't get better because, there's even more chances for interaction.
In those studies, that little graph of the 10,000 hour rule of deliberate practice, nobody does deliberate practice while texting. So, deliberate practice is you're fully engaged in what you're doing and you're not doing anything else. But here's the other thing about deliberate practice. In most studies, even of, virtuoso violinists and so forth, is that they actually don't do deliberate practice all day. So on average, it's even for world-class performers, it tends to be 4 or 5 hours of really concentrated, hard activity. And, the rest of the time, they're doing all the other things that we all have to do, like answer their email, etc. So I guess my message to her would be that, if you can at least turn off those distractions for 3 hours, 2 hours, 1 hour, right? And really, really, in a 100% way, do your homework, you might find actually that you get it all done. And then you can spend the other however many hours you have left. So I think segregating things, it might make sense just from an efficiency point of view. And then you can maybe sell it as, you'll have more time to go on Facebook.
I think you're absolutely on to something, that we're giving them different messages than we mean to be giving them. The parent is coming home from a long day of work and in fact begins another long day of work. And this is different in our culture now. We get home from the office and we begin again. We respond to our emails, we respond to our Gmails, we cook dinner, we're with the children, we start texting the people we never got to text, and we begin again. And maybe it is with Facebook on for some fun. And our children are seeing that. Now you can work 24/7. This is a tremendous concern of mine. I mean, let's take a look right here today. We're doing a conference right now on success and achievement and happiness, and we're all talking about Twitter and Facebook and Gmail. It's really very striking what's in this room, and it is of great concern, your question. The only thing you can tell your adolescent is, I can do some of my work after hours in a more relaxed way where I can multitask. I'm not sure you can write your history paper in the same way that I can finish up the email to my friend that I didn't get back to. I think you need more direct focus. I was at work all day, you were at school all day. Let's make time slots. That seems to be the most effective with adolescents right now. 8 to 9:30 homework, take a half-hour break for the computer. 10 to 11 homework, take a half-hour break for the television, done. How else can they learn to use all these what shall we call them, multimedia, I don't know what to call them anymore, multi-Twitters, and do their homework. So you just have to be trying to point out the difference between what you're trying to achieve and what they're trying to achieve.
But the other thing is, they have to understand the consequences. If you let them get by, let's say for a quarter, and you say, do what you want, then you'll see the results in the grades and teachers' comments and phone calls from the teachers, and then you have concrete evidence to say, this is not working for you.
I guess, so your question is about whether, in fact, being really gritty and putting in thousands of hours of deliberate practice actually yields for most people unhappiness. I mean, success maybe, but not happiness. And so, what does the data say? Maybe would be a question about that. So, in general, I ask, because I work at the Positive Psychology Center, if I've ever done a study, I've always asked happiness questions. I always ask about life satisfaction and positive emotion and so forth. And in general, what I've found with kids and with adults is that in general, happier people are more successful. So I haven't found a lot of evidence of it's lonely at the top or, at what cost success, etc. Now, that may be because, you look at 400 or 500 people and that's the general trend. But it could be that at the very, 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 very top, the people who are really, the Nobel laureates in the world, right? It could be that they are actually less happy. Even though there's a general trend that happiness and success go together, maybe at the very top echelons of success, maybe it is, lonely. I only know 2 Nobel laureates, and they seem to be pretty happy guys. But it's possible. I think one thing, to go back to these earlier comments, I've never studied anything where it was an externally imposed. You could argue that a lot of the spelling bee kids are under a lot of pressure, but really when we interviewed them, most of them to get to the finals, you know, the mom exhorting you to do it, most of these kids really did want to do it. So I mean, and you know, we study West Point cadets, you know, we ask them, like, do you really want to be here? Are you here for your family? I mean, they really want to be there. So I don't think I've ever studied a domain where there was a lot of extrinsic motivation. I've only studied sort of inner bliss kind of situations to some extent. But there I would argue, like, putting your kid in a violin program because you thought it was a good idea is very different from the kid asking to play violin. But I would make this other comment here, which is that I guess one of the things that I wanted to make clear, that in my research I show that even when people follow their inner bliss, even that they do want to be in the spelling bee, they do want to be at West Point, they want to get tenure as a professor, that's my case, there are elements of the practice, there are elements of your day that aren't, you know, intrinsic motivation and happiness aren't the first words that leap to mind. Like getting your 9th rejection for a journal article, or having to get yourself into the pool at 5 in the morning. Yes, you love swimming, but did you really feel like getting into the pool at 5 in the morning on that cold and wet day? So my point is that the intrinsic bliss, the intrinsic motivation is certainly hugely important. But even if you have that, you still don't necessarily have what it takes to sort of do these thousands of hours in addition. But you're talking about people who shift paradigms. It's not just that they do things really well, but they say, like, oh, no, we've actually been playing the wrong game. So I think that, you know, one thing that predicts that is...
In a society that from very early on looks down upon that.
Absolutely.
Totally against collaboration.
And none of our standardized tests, and none of our IQ tests or standardized tests pick up on this quality of thinking outside of the box.
Right.
So you're absolutely right. And some of the, you know, there's a very famous study of gifted children in California, the Herman study, which you probably know. And there have been at least, you know, it seems 2 Nobel laureates who are not picked up by the standard IQ testing because they were very good at, among other things, sort of divergent, like, well, what if you did it this way? But it doesn't come across on an IQ test, so they actually were sifted out of the study from the beginning.
You know, you might want to take a look at there's a lot of stuff on divergent thinking, and, you know, that would be a good place to start and see what characteristics these kids have from a very early age.
But I guess I would say one thing, by the way, is that if I really were made queen for a day, I would unplug everybody's television, because I've never found a single variable that was positively correlated with television watching. You know, kids who watch more television are fatter, they're less happy, they have fewer friends, they do worse in school. So, I mean, I read the Philadelphia Inquirer article once, and it was like, oh, well, you know, recommended is like an hour or 2 of screen time. It has to be high quality because you sit with your kid. I'm like, no, there is no such thing as, so the one little piece of your question, which I guess I would pick up on and amplify, is that really television watching doesn't predict anything good, and nobody should tell you otherwise.
You know what? You can turn the television off. Another awful thing I did was, as a parent, was when my kids were young. I said, you can watch what you want on the weekends, and you can watch one night during the week, 1 hour. Now, that was awful, hysterical. What? You know what? They did better in school, and I survived. You know, you have to be able to stand up to your kids.
Right. Don't be afraid to say no.
Yes.
So it's 5 o'clock. Let me close with a very famous quote, variously attributed to Dale Carnegie, Charles Kettering, Brother Dave Gardner, Warren Buffett, and Ingrid Bergman. All of them said this: success is getting what you want, happiness is wanting what you get.
Right.
May you all be both successful and happy.
Wow.
Let's thank our panelists.